I found out I'd been listed as a character reference in a court case I'd never heard of, for a person I hadn't spoken to in years. The judge quoted my name out loud. The defendant turned around and smiled at me like we shared a secret. And in that moment, I realized whatever was about to happen had already been decided with my help. Here's how it happened. Years ago, I used to volunteer once a week at a community program. Nothing dramatic, just tutoring adults who were trying to finish certifications or get back into the workforce. You meet a lot of people, most of them temporary. Conversations blur together. Names fade. One of them stood out, not because they were charming, but because they were quiet in a deliberate way. Polite, attentive, always early, always thanked me like I was doing them a huge favor, even when all I did was explain something basic. We talked occasionally after sessions. Nothing personal, mostly about work applications, background checks, how much employers cared about references. At some point, they asked if they could list me as someone who knew them in a professional capacity. I hesitated. They clarified quickly. Not as a reference you'll get called for, just a name to show I wasn't totally alone. It helps sometimes. That phrasing stuck with me, not totally alone. I said yes. They thanked me like I just changed their life. Months passed, then years. I stopped volunteering, changed jobs, moved departments. I forgot their name entirely, until the day I walked into a courthouse for jury duty. I was sitting in the back of a courtroom waiting to be dismissed when I heard my name. First, I thought someone else shared it. Then the judge repeated it slower. According to the character statement submitted, my full name described the defendant as reliable, trustworthy, and committed to personal growth. My stomach dropped. I stood up without thinking. Everyone turned to look at me, including the person at the defense table. They smiled, not relieved, not grateful, recognizing. I told the clerk there must be a mistake. I'd never written a statement, never been contacted, never agreed to anything beyond letting my name be listed years ago. The clerk frowned and said, "Your statement was submitted digitally, signed." I said it wasn't mine. She nodded like she'd heard that before. The judge asked if I wanted to clarify on the record, and that's when I realized something terrifying. Whatever I said next wouldn't just explain a misunderstanding. It would either help someone I barely remembered or destroy them, and the worst part, I had no idea what they were actually on trial for yet. The judge gave me two choices. I could clarify immediately on the record in front of everyone, or I could step outside with counsel and explain privately before the proceedings continued. I chose to step outside, mostly because my legs were shaking and I didn't trust my voice. In the hallway, a public defender approached me first. Calm, polite, almost grateful. She thanked me for being willing to support rehabilitation. That word, support, felt wrong. I told her I hadn't written anything, that I hadn't spoken to the defendant in years, that I didn't even remember half the details in the statement she was praising. Her expression didn't change, but her tone did. She said, "The statement is consistent with earlier documentation." I asked what earlier documentation. She hesitated, then said, "Employment references, volunteer logs, a mentor feedback form, forms I remembered filling out, but only partially, short answers, general impressions, things like shows up on time and takes feedback well, harmless things, things that had been stitched together into something far more persuasive." The prosecutor joined us next. He was less gentle. He asked me directly if I was denying authorship of the statement. I said yes. He asked if I was accusing the defense of forgery. I said I didn't know what I was accusing anyone of. I just knew the words weren't mine. That's when he showed me the document. My name, my email, a digital signature that looked like mine, close enough that I felt nauseous staring at it. Even the phrasing sounded like me, careful, balanced, reasonable, too reasonable. The prosecutor leaned in slightly and said, "If you recant now, the court will want to know why you waited until today." I told him I didn't know about it until today. He nodded, but his eyes said something else. That's not how this will sound. I finally asked the question no one had answered yet. What is this case about? The hallway went quiet. The public defender said it softly, like volume might soften the meaning. Financial coercion, manipulation, targeting vulnerable people through mentorship programs. My chest tightened. The defendant wasn't accused of stealing money directly. They were accused of positioning themselves close to people with authority, trust, or stability, then leveraging those relationships to influence outcomes. Recommendations, access, credibility, exactly what my name provided. I suddenly understood why the smile in the courtroom had felt wrong. I wasn't a surprise. I was an asset. The judge called us back in. As I walked toward the door, the defendant caught my eye again. This time, they didn't smile. They mouthed something instead. You said yes. And the terrifying part? They were right. Not to this, but to something close enough that the difference suddenly felt very thin. I'd agreed to be a name, presence, proof that they weren't alone. And now the court wanted to decide whether that agreement, casual, forgotten, years old, was enough to tip the scale. The judge asked me to take the stand. And in that moment, I realized there was no version of the truth that didn't help someone. The only question was who. When I sat down on the stand, the courtroom felt smaller than it had minutes earlier. The judge asked me to state my name for the record. I did. Hearing it echoed back through the microphone made everything feel final, like whatever I said next would fossilize into something permanent. The prosecutor started. He asked how I knew the defendant. I explained the volunteer program, the limited contact, the years that had passed. I emphasized how casual it all was, how unimportant it felt at the time. Then he asked if I had ever written or approved the character statement. I said no. The defense followed. They didn't challenge that. Instead, they asked me about my past interactions, my evaluations, my feedback. They projected old forms onto a screen, snippets of my own handwriting, my own words. Reliable, consistent, shows initiative, responds well to guidance. Each phrase was harmless on its own. Together, they formed the backbone of the statement I claimed I hadn't written. The defense attorney asked, calmly, "Do you deny these are your words?" I said no. She nodded and said, "Then isn't it possible someone compiled them to represent your opinion fairly?" The room murmured. The judge leaned forward. I felt trapped between two truths. I didn't write the statement, but I had written the pieces that made it believable. The prosecutor objected. The judge allowed the question to stand. Then came the question that broke something in me. If you had been asked to write a character reference at the time, the defense said, would you have refused? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out, because the honest answer was, I didn't know. I'd believed in second chances, in guidance, in helping people rebuild. That belief had been real. The defendant watched me closely, not pleading, not threatening, waiting. I finally said, I would have asked more questions. The judge asked, but you didn't ask those questions then, did you? No, I said. That was enough. The court recessed briefly. When they returned, the judge ruled the statement admissible, not as direct testimony, but as contextual evidence of character history. In other words, my name stayed. The verdict came later. Not guilty on the primary charge. Insufficient evidence of intent. The defendant turned around one last time as they were released. They didn't smile. They didn't mouth anything. They just nodded, like a deal had been honored. I walked out of the courthouse feeling hollow. I hadn't lied. I hadn't told the full truth either. I'd done what most people do when caught between responsibility and distance. I minimized, and someone walked free because of it. Weeks later, I got an email. No sender name, just a subject line. Thank you for believing in me. I never replied, but I think about it more than I want to admit. about how easy it is to say yes to something small, how long that yes can live, how it can be reshaped, reused, and weaponized years later without your consent. If you were in my place, would you have stood firmer and risked being wrong, or done what I did and lived with the uncertainty? If stories like this make you uncomfortable in the right way, subscribe now. These aren't just stories about other people. They're about the quiet decisions we all make and the consequences we never expect to carry. I was sitting in a hospital conference room being asked why I approved a medical decision that permanently changed someone's life. Everyone at the table kept calling me the responsible party. They kept asking why I didn't stop it. And no matter how many times I said I never agreed to anything, they kept looking at me like I was lying. Here's how it happened. 3 months earlier, I barely knew the person whose name was on the chart in front of me. We weren't friends. Not really. We worked in the same building, different departments. We talked maybe a handful of times. Small talk in elevators, complaining about coffee, that kind of thing. Nice enough. Forgettable. One afternoon, they stopped me in the lobby and asked a strange question. "Hey, this is random, but do you mind being listed as my emergency contact?" I laughed, thinking it was a joke. They explained they just moved, had no family nearby, and HR needed someone local on file. They said it was purely administrative. Worst case, I'd get a call if they fainted at work or something. It sounded harmless. I asked, what would I actually have to do? They shrugged. Probably nothing. Just a name and number. I hesitated for a second. Then I said yes. That was the moment I stopped being a coworker and became something else, without realizing it. Weeks passed. Nothing happened. I forgot about it completely. Then one night, around 2 a.m., my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. A calm voice said, "Are you listed as the emergency contact for their name?" My stomach tightened. They told me there'd been a medical incident. Not life-threatening, but serious enough that they needed me to come in. I drove to the hospital half awake, rehearsing what I'd say. I kept thinking they'd just need me to unlock a phone or call someone else. When I arrived, the nurse thanked me for coming so quickly and handed me paperwork, consent forms. I told her there must be a mistake. I wasn't family. I wasn't a partner. I barely knew this person. She looked confused, then concerned. "You're listed as the primary emergency contact," she said, "and as the person authorized to receive updates and make time-sensitive decisions if necessary." I laughed nervously. That can't be right. But it was. Their signature was right there. Mine wasn't, but apparently it didn't need to be. I asked to see them. They were sedated. Tubes. Machines. Nothing dramatic, but enough to make it real. A doctor explained there was a procedure they might need if things worsened. Not urgent yet, but possible. He said, "We'll keep you informed." I told him again, I shouldn't be the one deciding anything. He nodded sympathetically and said, "We'll do our best to reach next of kin if needed." I left at sunrise, shaken but relieved that nothing immediate had happened. 2 days later, I got another call. This time, they didn't ask me to come in. They asked why I'd approved the procedure. I said I hadn't. They said the authorization came from the emergency contact, me. That's when everything started unraveling, because I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't been there, and yet, something irreversible had been done, with my name attached to it. And sitting in that conference room weeks later, listening to lawyers and administrators debate responsibility, I realized the question wasn't whether I'd agreed. It was whether agreeing once to something small and harmless had already sealed it. The hospital kept using the same phrase over and over again. Implied authority. Every time they said it, my chest tightened. They explained it like this. When I agreed to be listed as the emergency contact, I became the default decision maker if the patient was unable to consent and no one else could be reached. It didn't matter that I wasn't family. It didn't matter that I barely knew them. What mattered was that my name was there. I told them I was never contacted about the procedure. They said the call was logged. Time, date, my phone number. I pulled out my phone right there in the conference room and scrolled through my call history. Nothing. No missed call. No voicemail. No unknown number at that time. I showed them. They didn't react the way I expected. Instead of concern, there was relief, like the answer to a question they already had. One of the administrators leaned forward and asked, "Is it possible someone else had access to your phone?" "No," I said immediately. Then I hesitated. "I mean, no, not that night." They asked where I was at the time of the authorization. "At home, alone, asleep." They nodded, taking notes. Then they told me what the procedure was. It wasn't life-saving. It wasn't an emergency in the dramatic sense. It was a preventative intervention that permanently altered the patient's quality of life. Something doctors debate. Something families argue about. Something people regret. When the patient woke up and found out, they were furious. Not at the doctors. At me. Apparently, when they asked who approved it, my name was given without hesitation. Emergency contact. Responsible party. Decision maker. The patient demanded to see me. I didn't want to go, but the hospital strongly suggested it. For closure, they said. When I walked into the room, they were awake, pale, but alert. The moment they saw me, their expression changed. Not confusion, betrayal. "You did this," they said. I tried to explain. I told them I never approved anything, that I wasn't even there, that someone must have made a mistake. They didn't believe me. They said a nurse came in during the night, said they'd spoken to me, said I'd agreed. They said the nurse even mentioned something personal, something only I should have known. A detail from one of our elevator conversations weeks earlier. That's when I felt the floor drop out from under me, because that meant whoever approved the procedure didn't just use my name. They knew enough about me to sound like me. I asked the hospital for the recording of the call. There wasn't one. "System error," they said. "Happens sometimes." I asked who the nurse was. They said the nurse was no longer on that shift. I asked if they were being investigated. They said internal review was ongoing. Everything felt deliberately vague. Soft edges. No firm answers. And then the patient did something I didn't expect. They filed a complaint. Not against the hospital, but against me. Claimed negligence. Claimed I abused authority. Claimed I made a decision I had no right to make. I received the notice in the mail 2 weeks later. Seeing my name in legal language, next to words like harm and liability, made me physically sick. I contacted a lawyer. They asked the same question everyone else did. "Why did you agree to be the emergency contact?" I said the same thing every time. I thought it didn't mean anything. That's when the lawyer said something that still echoes in my head. It always means something to someone. As the weeks dragged on, pieces started surfacing. HR emails, hospital intake notes, timestamps that didn't line up. A nurse's ID badge logged into a terminal while records showed they were on break. No smoking gun, just enough wrongness to feel intentional. And the patient? They stopped blaming me. Not because they forgave me, but because they believed something worse. They believed I'd been used. And if that was true, then the question wasn't who approved the procedure. It was who needed it approved badly enough to steal my identity to do it. By the time the hospital scheduled another meeting, this time with legal counsel present, I already knew this wasn't about a mistake anymore. It was about containment, and I was the easiest thing to contain. The hospital settled with the patient quietly. No press, no admission of fault, just paperwork and signatures and an agreement that everything would remain confidential. The patient got compensation. I got something else entirely. I got erased. The complaint against me was withdrawn, not because I was cleared, but because it was no longer useful. My lawyer explained it bluntly. Once the hospital accepted liability privately, There was no reason to keep me in the line of fire. That should have felt like relief. Didn't, because no one ever explained who made the call. The implied authority explanation vanished. The nurse who supposedly spoke to me, no longer employed. The access logs, archived. The internal review, closed. When I asked if my name had been officially cleared from the record, the answer was careful. There's no active finding of wrongdoing, not the same as innocence. I reached out to the patient one last time. I wanted closure, or forgiveness, or maybe just to hear someone else admit the truth out loud. They met me at a cafe near the hospital. They looked different, slower, tired in a way that wasn't physical. "I don't think you did it," they said before I could speak. "Not anymore." I asked what changed. They told me someone had visited them after the settlement. Someone who didn't introduce themselves. Someone who spoke like they belonged there. They didn't threaten. They didn't apologize. They just said, "What happened needed to happen," and then they left. That sentence hit harder than any accusation, because it reframed everything. The emergency contact wasn't a convenience. It was a tool. Someone needed a decision made without delay, without debate, and without family interference. They needed a name that wouldn't ask questions, wouldn't push back, wouldn't have power afterward. They needed someone disposable. They needed me. I tried to file a report. Without evidence, it went nowhere. I tried to get my name removed from every system I could think of. Some places said yes. Some didn't respond. Months later, I ran into a former administrator from the hospital at a grocery store. They recognized me instantly. I could tell by the way their face changed. They said nothing, just nodded and walked away, like we shared something unspoken. And that's what stays with me. Not the fear of being blamed again, but the realization that systems don't always break. Sometimes they function exactly as designed. They just need the right person in the right place to absorb the damage. I still think about that moment in the lobby when I agreed to be an emergency contact. How small it felt. How harmless. If I'd said no, someone else would have said yes. But it wouldn't have been me. And that's the part one can't escape. Because if being helpful once is all it takes to be used forever, how many of us are walking around right now already listed somewhere, waiting to be blamed for a decision we'll never remember making? If this story made you uncomfortable, good. These are the kinds of situations no one warns you about, the ones where doing something kind quietly hands someone else control over your life. Subscribe if you want more real, unsettling Reddit stories that don't give easy answers, because the next one might make you question something you've already agreed to without thinking. The police asked me why my phone number appeared in an investigation timeline tied to a crime I didn't even know had happened. They said a single phone call made from my device changed the direction of the case. They wanted to know who I was calling, why I sounded calm, and why I hung up so quickly. I told them the truth. I never made that call. And that's when one of them said, "Then you should be very worried. Here's how it happened." It was late, close to midnight, when someone tapped my shoulder outside a convenience store. I just paid and stepped out, scrolling on my phone, half distracted. The guy looked normal, not frantic, not aggressive, just tired. He asked politely if he could use my phone to make a quick call. Said his battery had died. Said it was urgent but short. I hesitated. Everyone does now. But we were standing under bright lights, people coming in and out, cameras everywhere. It didn't feel risky. I said, "Put it on speaker." He agreed immediately. That should have been my first warning. He dialed a number from memory. "No hesitation. No checking." Someone picked up almost instantly. He didn't say much, just a few clipped sentences that didn't mean anything to me at the time. "Yeah, I'm outside now." "No, I didn't bring it. Plans still on." Then he hung up, handed my phone back, thanked me, and walked away. Total time, maybe 20 seconds. I forgot about it before I even got to my car. 2 weeks later, an officer knocked on my door. They were calm, professional, asked if they could ask me a few questions about a phone call placed on my number late one night. They had the exact time, the exact duration. I laughed, assuming it was some mistake. Told them I hadn't made any unusual calls. They asked if I'd let anyone else use my phone recently. My stomach dropped. I told them about the guy outside the store, emphasized how quick it was, how harmless it seemed, how I didn't even know who he called. They didn't interrupt. When I finished, one of them said, "That call was used to confirm a location." I asked, "For what?" They didn't answer directly, just said it connected someone to a place they later denied being anywhere near. I tried to downplay it, said it was on speaker, that I was right there, that it couldn't mean anything. That's when they told me the call recording didn't include my voice at all. Not even in the background. No street noise. No castir. No door chime. Just his voice. Clean. Clear. Like it was made somewhere quiet. They asked me if I'd altered the audio. I laughed again, too loud this time, and said, "Why would I even know how to do that?" They didn't laugh back. They asked if I'd noticed anything strange about my phone afterward. Any apps crashing. Any settings changed. Any permissions I didn't recognize. I said no. That's when they told me something that made my skin crawl. According to the data, the call didn't originate outside the convenience store. It originated from inside my apartment, at a time when I wasn't home, and somehow my phone was still in my pocket. That was the moment I realized letting someone make one quick call wasn't the mistake. The mistake was assuming the call ever needed my phone at all. The officers didn't accuse me outright. That was almost worse. They kept saying things like, "We're just trying to understand the sequence," and "Help us make this make sense." Every question sounded reasonable on its own, but together they formed a picture I didn't recognize. One where I wasn't a bystander, but a participant. They showed me a printout of my phone's activity. Not just calls, location pings, background processes, network handoffs. Lines of data I'd never look at in my life. According to it, my phone had briefly connected to a private Wi-Fi network inside my apartment complex at the exact time the call was placed. I told them that was impossible. They told me it was unlikely, but not impossible. That's when they asked if anyone had ever handled my phone before the call. I thought back. The store, the guy's hands, the way he held the phone confidently, like it wasn't unfamiliar. I asked what the call was connected to. They finally told me, an assault that happened less than an hour later, a few miles away. The call wasn't a confession. It was a confirmation, a green light, someone checking whether a location was clear, whether someone was home, whether a plan could move forward. The call from my number told them yes. I felt sick. I told them again I had no idea who the guy was, that I didn't even know his name. They asked me to describe him. Height, build, clothing, anything. I couldn't give them much, and that seemed to worry them, because the surveillance footage from the store showed him approaching me but not leaving. After he handed my phone back, he never appeared on any camera again. Not exiting, not crossing the lot, not walking down the street, just gone. They asked if I lived alone. I said yes. They asked if I'd noticed anything off in my apartment recently. Drawers out of place, doors unlocked, electronics behaving strangely. I hadn't until they asked. Then I remembered my phone lagging the next day, battery draining faster than usual. A permissions notification I dismissed without reading. They explained carefully that there are ways to mirror calls, spoof origins, route activity through devices that never visibly leave someone's hands. Ways that don't require hacking in the dramatic sense, just access, seconds of it. I asked them if they thought the man had been inside my apartment. They didn't answer. Instead, they asked if I'd be willing to let forensics examine my phone and my home. I didn't feel like I had a choice. They took my phone, bagged it like evidence, walked through my apartment photographing outlets, routers, vents. One of them paused near my bedroom window and asked how often I left it unlocked. Couldn't remember. 2 days later, they called me back in. They told me the phone had been modified, but not recently. Whatever software was on it had been installed weeks before the convenience store incident, before I ever met the guy, which meant the favor wasn't the beginning. It was the confirmation. Someone had prepared my phone in advance, waited patiently, then used a moment of trust to activate something that had already been there. I asked the question that had been clawing at me since the interview started. Why me? The officer sighed and said, because you were predictable. Predictable schedule, predictable routines, predictable kindness, easy to study, easy to stage around. They let me leave again, but this time they said, don't assume this is over. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the empty space where my phone used to be, trying to figure out how long someone had been inside my life without me noticing, and whether the call I remembered, the one outside the store, was even real, or just a performance to make sure I never questioned what had already been done. They never charged me. That's what everyone told me to focus on, as if the absence of handcuffs meant the absence of consequences. The investigation moved on without me. New leads, new suspects. My phone was returned weeks later, wiped clean, factory reset, sealed in an evidence bag like a warning. But the damage didn't reset with it. The assault case stalled. Evidence was insufficient. Timelines became uncertain. And the call from my number, clean, calm, perfectly placed, remained a ghost in the file. It was acknowledged, then quietly minimized. I asked the officers one last time if they believed me. One of them said, "We don't think you planned anything." The other said nothing. That silence told me everything. I moved. Different apartment, different routines, new locks, new phone. I stopped helping strangers. I stopped answering unknown numbers. I stopped assuming public spaces were safe just because there were lights and cameras. Then, 6 months later, I got a voicemail. No caller ID, no missed call notification, just a message that appeared out of nowhere. "Still being predictable," a voice said. Then it ended. I took it to the police. They couldn't trace it. Said it could have been spoofed. Could have been anyone. But I knew. Not because I recognized the voice, but because of the tone. Casual. Confident. Like someone checking in on a project they'd already finished. That's when the part that truly unsettled me clicked into place. The call from my phone didn't just help someone commit a crime. Proved a system worked. That with enough preparation, you don't need accomplices. You don't need consent. You just need proximity, trust, a moment where someone hands over their life without realizing it. I wasn't framed. I was tested, and I passed. Sometimes I think about how many times I've let someone borrow a charger, use my hotspot, step into my apartment, just for a second. How many of us do it every day without thinking? If someone wanted to use you, really use you, how would you even know? That's the part that keeps me awake. Because I still don't know whether the man outside the store was the same person who entered my apartment weeks earlier, or just the face they chose so I'd remember the wrong moment as the beginning. If this story made you rethink even one small, harmless favor, subscribe now. These aren't stories about monsters in the dark. They're about how easily normal people get pulled into something they never agreed to, and don't realize it until it's far too late.